Hi, today I want to talk to you about the Second Great Awakening. This was a Protestant religious revival in the United States in the early 19th century. And it spread religion by emotional preaching, by camp meetings and revivals, by circuit riders who went from town to town enthusiastically preaching the gospel. And these revivals attracted hundreds of converts to the Protestant denominations. The denominations that grew the quickest were the new Baptist and Methodist groups. Historians named the Second Great Awakening in the context of the First Great Awakening, and I have a video about that, and I'll put a link in the description box, and the Third Great Awakening of the late early 1900s, and I plan to make a video about that in the future. The Second and Third Awakenings were part of a larger movement that I mentioned before that was going on in England and Germany and Scotland called Romanticism. And this Romanticism was characterized by being a movement of the heart, by emotionalism. New religious movements have emerged during this awakening, including Adventism, Dispensationalism, and the Latter-day Saint movement. I'll talk more about those in just a minute. Although the awakening occurred in several, I guess you could say, waves, different events in different denominations, all the revivals were very similar. Now, about theology of the time, the post-millennialist theology dominated American Protestantism. And that is the idea that Jesus will return again to the earth to rule over his kingdom, but will not do that until there has been a long period of peace and prosperity and goodwill among men. And because of this was an impetus for the promotion of progressive reforms. And a number of historians will recognize that these reforms seem to be a direct result of this thinking. Now, one of the revivals that was instrumental in bringing people to the faith became known as the Restoration Movement. And this was a group of non-denominational churches that, they were committed to trying to restore Christianity in its original and more primitive form, as they saw it described, or their interpretation of what it was, based upon the New Testament, especially the book Acts of the Apostles. And this movement was spearheaded by the Campbell brothers, and sometimes the followers were called Campbellites. The churches that evolved from this movement are usually called Churches of Christ, Christian churches, Disciples of Christ, and in Canada, the Evangelical Christian Church. Converts, it's interesting to note, during these revivals were predominantly female. And this movement gave some support and additional power to women in their social standing, and they found it attractive. The idea that there could be more equality between men and women was a a side effect of this movement. Another thing that came out of it in the 30s and 40s in North America was the Adventist movement, where preachers such as William Miller preached to his followers, who became known as Millerites, and his preaching actually led to what is called the Great Disappointment in American religious history, and I do have a video about it, and I'll put that in the description also. From the Great Disappointment, however, came the Adventist churches, the Christian Adventist Church and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is quite a large and powerful denomination today. Efforts to apply Christian teaching to the resolution of social problems later developed into what was called the social gospel. And at some time I'll try to go into more detail about the social gospel movement, especially in the early 1900s prior to World War I, in a later video. Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit about this movement. You may have heard of something called dispensationalism, and that's a theology also that came forth from the Second Great Awakening. And that is the idea that God, the Creator God, deals differently with people at different times in history, so that the communication between God and humans and the rules in the Garden of Eden, we can see, are not the same as those for the Jewish people in the dispensation of the law, as it's called, and not the same as the current dispensation of grace. And I believe that that some dispensationalists propagate 7 different dispensations, and it helps in their thinking to understand your relationship with the Creator God, if you know what dispensation you're speaking about. So a lot of interesting things came to the forefront, even though some of the seeds of them might have been planted previously. They became part of the stream of American Christian religious history. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Please leave your comments and questions. I try to answer them all, and your suggestions for things you'd like to hear about in the future. And if you're part of any of the groups that I mentioned, or are familiar with any of the doctrines and have comments or questions, I always like to hear about your personal experience with these things. So I'll see you again soon. In the meantime, please stay safe and well. Bye for now.